I was wondering, you were blessed enough to have a tremendous impact on both Jesus scholarship and Pauline scholarship early in your career, and you've kind of been here through the pushback, and now you're writing your kind of mature reflections on these things. So what would you say that you articulate differently now in this book than ideas that you might have had earlier, but you said in a different way? Can you speak about any ways that your thought has kind of grown? Maybe briefly in the Jesus part of the book and a little bit on Paul.
Yeah. That's a good question. In some ways, it's hard to know one's own mind, because when you're thinking certain thoughts, it often feels as though you've always thought them, and then you look back, and sometimes the other way around. Sometimes you think, I've only just thought that in the last 2 years, and then you look back at something you wrote 20 years ago, and there it was anyway. And so I think in some ways other people would see it better than me. I've been aware particularly that in the 90s and then in the last 15 or 20 years, the theme of the temple has come up much bigger. It was there in the Jesus book, but it's now loomed much larger, and you heard a bit of it in my spiel today. And looking at Paul's vision of community has changed, and the idea of the Spirit forming the church to be the people of God for the world has been fleshed out now much more than it was before. And hence, I think in this book, looking at, as Mike said, the early communities and what they were and how they understood themselves. It's not just a combination of people who believe in Jesus so they get together to say prayers. Well, it is that, but there's something much more organic going on, and I think that's bubbling up in the book. Would you agree with that, Mike?
Yeah, I would say definitely. In terms of, particularly with Tom's career, there are some statements that have seemed controversial, and Tom has rightly stuck with them. Like, I think the still in exile motif, although we might want to tinker with footnotes a bit on some tellings, I think Tom's basically right. And if you just read Matthew 8, many will come from the east and the west and sit with Abraham. And this is end of exile language. So I'm always kind of baffled why people are resisting this. And in terms of maybe a slight development in your thought, Tom, I'd point to something like on justification, where you use the categories of eschatology and covenant to describe it in Paul and the faithfulness of God. Now, the building blocks were there earlier, but not the language. So I think there was a kind of refinement going on. And when you refine it in that way, I think it also assuages a whole bunch of your critics, because some people were worrying that you were collapsing justification to ecclesiology, which was never really the case, because you always talked about being part of God's forgiven family. But when you sort of deployed it further in terms of covenant eschatology, I think that's a refinement of what you're doing, and that comes out in the book as well.
Yes. Good.
Am I allowed to answer my own question too? I thought that one of the things that became clearer, because you focus a lot on retelling Israel's story and putting that at the center of Paul's thought. And initially there was some pushback because they say that your focus on the climax of Israel's story downplayed sin. But what I appreciated as time went on, you talked about Israel needed a savior because Israel too was in Adam. Mm-hmm. And I think the Adamic language kind of got the sin stuff that some of the Reformed brothers and sisters were upset about, but also kept the narrative. And so I thought, as someone who's kind of reading Paul, the final version of your discussion of Paul, it's the greater emphasis on Israel in Adam, which allows you to keep both the sin and the narrative together in one place.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. And I have to say, looking back from the great height of the age of 70, sort of think, I now know about how things work more than I did. And when people used to say 20, 30 years ago, oh, N.T. Wright's either gone soft on sin or is producing a theology of justification which isn't about sin, that was always ridiculous. I know myself to be a sinner, and I know happily that I am a forgiven sinner. That's never very far from my consciousness, and it's never very far from my theology. The problem with theology is that you have to say everything all at once, otherwise people think you've deliberately missed something out. But there are several things which are hard to say because you have to go right round the circle and say, and then if you try to do that every time, well, you end up writing very long books, as I seem to have done. So I think what's happened is that sometimes I've written something and then critics have come back and say, oh, you seem to be saying this. And I think, well, I certainly didn't mean that. Or if I did, I was explaining and justifying more than that. If I may, a little anecdote. Earlier this summer, I visited the great man Jim Packer, J.I. Packer, in Regent College, Vancouver, and it was, I think, his 93rd birthday, something like that. Wow. And I'd known Jim for 40 years, and I had a lovely conversation with him. And I thanked him for writing a blurb for some of my books, granted that I knew he probably disagreed with them. And he said to me, well, Tom, he said, when I read what you write, I often find myself thinking, you can't possibly mean that, can you? And then he said, I would read on and I think you do mean that. And what's more, you've made a very good argument. And I thought, this is a nunc dimittis moment. You know, I can die happy if Jim Packer thinks I made a good argument. That's, so we go around the circle.